Today is Valentine's Day, and with everyone else out there spending time with the people they love, all I got is my love of video games. Probably about 10 months ago now, I made a YouTube short talking about my top 5 favorite video games of all time. However, that was a short, so I didn't really get the time to talk that much about each game, and my opinions have also changed quite a bit since then. On top of that, I included every FNAF game in one spot just as an average, but that's kinda unfair since it's not one game. So in this video, I'll be discussing my top 5 favorite individual games of all time. Or at least that was the plan. I was gonna do top 5 in this video, but I finished the script for the video months ago, and since then I played a few games that actually overtook some of the spots on the list, so instead of completely scrapping everything I said about some of these games, I just kept playing new games and adding stuff to the list, and eventually I decided to just turn it into a top 10. I'm sure this list will change considering I plan on playing a bunch more games over the course of this year, but at the present moment, these are my top 10 favorite games of all time. It's important to remember that this is only my list, and there's a lot of iconic games out there that I haven't played before, or that I just don't like as much as some other people do. So instead of getting mad at me if your favorite game doesn't make my list, let me know in the comments what your favorite games are. But without further ado, let's get started. I think that while a lot of the games on my list are ones many people wouldn't have on theirs, it's easier to understand why I picked the games that I did. Most of these games I think most people would understand me having on my list, except maybe number 10. I have been a huge fan of Mario games since I was a little kid. I kinda miss how my sister and I used to have random moments where we decided to replay a Mario game and just spent the next few days just doing it. The thing is though, that I never really played that many Mario games. I played Super Mario 3D World and Land, New Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, Wii, and U. I played a couple other games like some Mario Karts and Mario Galaxy, but I didn't really play them a lot, so I really didn't play very many Mario games. But my favorite Mario game that I have played is New Super Mario Bros. U. I've always liked the 2D Mario games better personally, but I found out only a few months ago that while many people like this game, New Super Mario Bros. U is not one of the ones that people look most fondly at. A lot of people do like the game, yeah, but some people say that it's not very imaginative or that it's soulless, but I don't really think that's true. Most 2D Mario games are kind of the same thing, so it's kind of hard to come up with new ideas, but I think U does manage to pretty well, and I really don't think it's soulless. It's got great graphics, awesome levels, great power-ups, and a pretty interesting Bowser fight. Overall, it's pretty unique compared to other 2D Mario games. Like I said, I haven't played that many Mario games, so I don't have a whole lot to compare to. New Super Mario Bros. U is just one of those games that I could play over and over again. It was a big part of my childhood, and while I haven't played it in years and actually can't play it anymore due to the fact that I lost the wires for my Wii U and don't have a Nintendo Switch, I still love this game. But I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that would place it as my 10th favorite game of all time. 2023 was a pretty great year. We got lots of FNAF content, the year of FNAF 3 and Avengers Endgame, and it was great in terms of stuff happening in my real life and in terms of media. It could have been better, but it was still a great year. But one of my favorite parts of the year was me getting into a game series because of a game in the series that came out during the year. That series is Resident Evil. I got really into Resident Evil in 2023, and now most of the games in the series that I've played so far are some of my favorite games. At a certain point, I decided it would be fun to get into more Resident Evil stuff, starting from Resident Evil 7 and playing more of the games as time went on, and I've been streaming them. Resident Evil 7 was the first of these games that I streamed, and it's the first Resident Evil game that ends up on this list. I haven't played Resident Evil 6 yet, and I haven't played very much of 5, but what I do know is that those games strayed away from horror and focused more on action, and that among other things ended up dividing people. Resident Evil 7 reinvented the series in a fantastic way, returning to its horror roots and doing it in a first-person perspective to further enhance that horror. Outside of a few jump scares, I didn't end up getting too scared while actually playing the game, but it's just the idea of the game and the enemies in it, most of all Jack, that make the game so horrifying. Outside of just the horror, it's really fun too, and while the story ends up getting pretty wacky, it is a great and interesting story. The combat is cool and the molded enemies are kinda cool, but I personally think they could have been cooler. I personally prefer Resident Evil 7 over 8 overall, but I think the combat and enemies were better in 8, but the story and more consistent horror of 7 keep it above 8, which is a bit lower and unfortunately off this list. But Resident Evil 7 takes the number 9 spot. I don't think it'll be surprising for you guys to learn that the number 1 most popular game in the world is on my list. It's probably millions of people's favorite game, if not more than that, including my brother's, and while it isn't my favorite game of all time, Minecraft is a super fun game. I'll be honest, I don't really play survival Minecraft on my own, but that doesn't mean that it isn't fun to do. Minecraft is a super creative game as it allows you to basically do whatever you want. There's so many different mods for the game. There's the creative mode, which allows you to build or do pretty much anything. There's hardcore for if you want to challenge yourself, and there's numerous public servers. I love just hopping on Hypixel to play some murder mystery, Blocking Dead, or sometimes Bed Wars. While I don't play Minecraft that often, I probably have played it more than any other game in the world. No, I've definitely played it more than any other game in the world. I always love when I start a new SMP with my friends, which we've actually done recently and are still doing, and that's like one of the most fun experiences ever, just playing Minecraft with your friends in a server, and I'm really excited for what's gonna happen in the future of the one that just started. So Minecraft definitely belongs in the top 10 at the very least, but I personally would place it at number 8. It, along with Mario games, was basically my entire childhood, and YouTubers like popular MMOs were a really big part of that childhood. His channel is kind of broken now, and has been ever since that whole breakup thing, but every now and then I find myself returning to his older videos to return to when I was like 10. Minecraft is and always has been and probably always will be a big part of my life, and while it's not my favorite game of all time, it's definitely pretty high up there, and it will always hold a special place in my heart. Next up, the number 7 slot on my list is probably something you guys would have expected to be a bit higher up given the majority of my content, but I think being my 7th favorite game of all time is fair for Five Nights at Freddy's VR Help Wanted. FNAF VR has been my favorite FNAF game ever since I played it around August or September of 2019, back when I was 12, and while not everyone agrees with it being the best FNAF game, I think it's easy to understand why. I'm a really big fan of playing in VR. It's really fun to actually be active and feel almost like you're actually in the game. I'm lucky enough that unlike many people, I don't really get motion sick while playing VR, which probably has something to do with the fact that I played Iron Man VR, which I also really liked, but it's not on this list. I haven't played every VR game out there, obviously, but I love all of the ones that I have. FNAF is also one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, so while there's definitely more than just 6 games better than FNAF VR, just because I think something is better doesn't mean that I like it more. For example, I think Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is a better movie than Spider-Man No Way Home, but I also like No Way Home more. There's a difference between what is my favorite and what I think is the best, and FNAF VR is my 7th favorite game of all time. Mixing two of my favorite things, FNAF and VR, is so much fun to explore, and there's such a good combination. VR horror games are really effective, and FNAF VR is great because FNAF just works really well in VR, and I feel like if you have a VR headset, both FNAF VR games are a must play. I think almost all the levels in FNAF VR are super fun to play, especially Plush Baby, even though everyone else hates that level, and the Curse of Dreadbear DLC, while in my opinion not as good as the main game, is also really good and adds quite a few great levels, some of my favorites, including Trick or Treat and Build-A-Mangle. On top of that, it also introduced Glitchtrap, who has become one of my favorite FNAF characters. While he's now a bit more controversial in terms of the story that follows him and the program he seems to be made of, I think in the form of Glitchtrap, he is amazing. I also think that while the non-VR mode isn't quite as fun as the incredibly immersive VR mode, it is still fun to return to casually, and the addition of Princess Quest on the mobile port was very interesting to see. The story of this game, including the hidden tapes and of course Glitchtrap, are very interesting, and when Help Wanted 2 was announced, the only thing I was worried about was whether or not it would be better than the first, which is really not an easy feat. So was Help Wanted 2 better than 1? Well, let's talk about that. I already did a review video on Help Wanted 2, so for this section of the video, I'll just basically pull from the review, but if you want my full thoughts on the game, you can check out that review video. Whenever I play FNAF VR, I'm always really panicky and nervous that I'm gonna get jump scared unless I see it coming. That's why I never play the Funtime Freddy or Funtime Foxy levels anymore, because I'm a wuss. But in Help Wanted 2, I didn't really find myself all that panicked that I was gonna get jump scared. Instead, I'm more panicked just about the environment that I'm in. Unlike in FNAF VR, I think one of my favorite levels in the entire game is the Funtime Freddy level. It's cool to see a nice spin of what I consider to be one of the more iconic levels of the FNAF games. In this game, although the jump scares do get me sometimes, they don't scare me all that much, which is mostly because you get a lot of chances and the game often warns you before you die. This game makes me feel more actual dread. I worry more about dying than getting jump scared, and I know that sounds like the same thing, but it's not. The Ballora minigame's environment is just as unsettling as the Funtime Freddy one, and I'd argue that while I don't like the minigame quite as much, it is still a great minigame, and I think it's definitely a scarier one. With the mini-arenas blocking your path, the biddy-babs lying on the sides of the auditorium, and the pitch blackness of the room, I was honestly terrified when playing this minigame to the point that I was literally shaking, and hearing the pitter-patter of a biddy-bab and looking over to see this monster baby thing running out at me from the darkness was probably the most terrifying part of the entire game. Oh my god! Pretty much all the levels of this game are pretty fun to play, and what adds to them is the variance and replayability. There's multiple different things that can happen in most levels, and everything that does happen is completely random, making the levels different every time you play them. This allows for a lot of replayability, as you're not just playing the same thing every time, kinda like Build a Mangle and Trick or Treat and Curse of Dreadbear, which are some of my favorite minigames in all three FNAF VR experiences. Sure, when you replay it, you know how to do it, but you can't just memorize exactly what's going to happen. You have to pay attention, and with everything constantly being different, even if you die and just restart, it makes the levels a lot more fun, and just slightly more difficult. With that being said, the game is mostly pretty easy. There are a couple levels that can be pretty challenging, like the food prep minigames and nights 4 and 5 of Fizzy Fast, just because it's easy to mess up. And Balora's minigame can also be pretty difficult sometimes. Even those levels though are really not that hard. There's some minigames that I died a bunch on, but not because they were hard, more so because I was just being stupid or making dumb mistakes. I feel like the game is lacking the challenge that the first game had in some levels, like some of the Night Terrors and FNAF 1. Sure, you may die a few times, but rarely will you get stuck on a level, or at the very least, I didn't. I just think the game should have been a bit more challenging. The game is super fun though. Not every level is really scary, but the scary ones and the non-scary ones are pretty much all fun. The lows are way higher than the lows from the first game, and I think the highs are about on par. With all that being said though, what about the story? Before I finished the game, I heard a lot of people saying that the game was a bit bare bones in terms of the story, and I think I can agree with that. There's a decent amount of lore, but the game doesn't have all that much in terms of the events within it. What was good about FNAF VR 1 was that there was a constant story being told, but in Help Wanted 2, there's only one minor and vague thing at the beginning, one pretty big reveal around midway through, and then the ending. Don't get me wrong, the endings are plenty interesting, and playing a 3D VR Princess Quest was sick, outside of the fact that we can only teleport and couldn't move on our own.
Who's the princess now, bitch?
But I just feel like there could have been more. I do think the lore of this game is interesting, but I personally think in terms of story, the first Help Wanted was better, but the story of 2 is still pretty good. The gameplay of 1 had some high highs, but some decently low lows, and the gameplay of 2 has some very high highs and some high lows as well. The worst parts of Help Wanted 2 are still fun to play, but the worst parts of Help Wanted 1 kinda aren't. Personally, I think in terms of gameplay, Help Wanted 2 is more fun, and while the story isn't quite as good, it's still good enough that it doesn't bring this game down from above FNAF VR Help Wanted. Labeling Help Wanted 2 as my new favorite FNAF game and placing it at the number 6 slot of my list of my favorite games of all time is fair enough in my book. The game at my number 5 spot used to be my number 1, but recently a game came out that was better in every way possible, and so I bumped it down a few spots. My number 5 slot goes to Marvel's Spider-Man. I don't think it takes a genius to realize that I love superheroes, and I also don't think it would surprise you that Spider-Man is my favorite superhero. But I think what will surprise you is the fact that while I've always loved Spider-Man, he wasn't always my favorite superhero before. I don't love this game because Spider-Man is my favorite superhero. Spider-Man is my favorite superhero because I love this game. This game delivered my single favorite version of Spider-Man in any media to date, and one of my top 3 favorite characters in all of fiction. This game really understands Spider-Man, and hammers home the point of how Spider-Man winning means Peter Parker loses. The story is so human, and there's moments where you can really identify and relate with the characters. The boss fights, while all pretty similar to each other, are always fun to play through, especially the Electro and Vulture and Doc Ock boss battles. The combat in this game is typically really smooth, and it's always really satisfying to fight. The one issue I can see with the combat is the system of swapping the gadgets and how it just slows everything down. It kinda just interrupts the combat, which is slightly annoying. Overall though, this was my favorite game of all time for quite a while. The combat is immensely satisfying, the swinging is almost perfect with only a few things to have been added, and the story is one of the best Spider-Man stories to date. All the characters are great, and while the MJ and Miles missions aren't quite as fun, I do like the contrast of being able to play as the more powerful Spider-Man and then being exposed to weakness and powerlessness. It could be better, but it also could be worse. Some of the Miles and MJ missions are actually genuinely pretty fun to me, like the Tombstone MJ mission and the Rhino Miles mission. So overall, Marvel's Spider-Man fills in the number 5 spot. It would have been number 1 before, but while I very obviously adore this game, other games have overtaken it for me. But I will from now and then still return and do random crimes and swing around on the PC version when I'm bored. Before I started streaming the Resident Evil games, I played only 3 Resident Evil games. The second one I played was the Resident Evil 2 remake. When I first played it, I didn't play much of it, only playing up until Ben dies in the prison cell on Leon's path. At the time, I thought it was a good game, but at the same time, I didn't really enjoy it, mostly because I was really bad at it. However, However, more recently, I streamed playing through all 4 paths of the game, and every single one was absolutely fantastic. I was a lot better at the game, and I just had a lot more fun with it. Mr. X was a super menacing character in this game as well. The fact that he was constantly wandering around made the game a lot more difficult, and he was just absolutely terrifying in general. I'm really glad I decided to play this game again because it was just great. I also think that Leon as a character is written very well, and in the Resident Evil 4 remake, he has a very natural progression from this game. The zombies move and make noises exactly how I think zombies should, very similar in nature to the ones from The Walking Dead, only much more durable and hard to kill, as well as animals also being able to get infected, and also have more than one virus and different types of enemies, like the regular zombies and lickers with the T virus, and Birkin and the G adults with the G virus. It is a little weird that we can't just push them off us or stealth kill them with a knife, and it's also kind of weird that multiple gunshots to the head sometimes don't even take them down, not to mention the fact that canonically a single bite will kill you, but it takes at least 3 to actually kill us. But it makes sense because it's a video game. Canonically, the zombies do die in one shot to the head as shown in the cutscene at the very beginning of the game, but if that was the case in the gameplay, the game would just be way too easy. And because of the nature of the game, there also has to be a health bar, so biting only doing damage makes sense. Canonically, we never get bit, and I think with that knowledge, it makes sense. I also really like the boss fights, especially the one against Birkin right after grabbing the G sample, and I think it's really cool that there are 4 similar yet unique paths of the game. The main Leon and Claire paths are fantastic, and I think both do certain things better. The storyline with Ada is more interesting than the still interesting Sherry storyline, and the first encounter with Birkin is more interesting in Claire's storyline. Each path does different things better than the other, but I think that both do everything well at worst and spectacularly at best. Over the course of 6 streams, I played through each of the 4 different paths, and while the puzzles and gameplay were pretty similar in each one, and there were many sections of the game that were exactly the same or super similar to each other, I never got bored of it. The game does really well in terms of horror and tension, and I really like that the other character leaves the notes for us on the second runs, but I will say that the continuity in the second runs make absolutely no sense, especially with the puzzles being reset and Mr. X literally dying and disappearing from Claire's run while still being in Leon's, as well as Leon and Claire's second run being ahead of her despite the fact that he literally took a nap and Claire took no breaks. Besides that though, I don't really have that many complaints about the game. The tension is really good, especially when you have to run from Mr. X with lickers around, and Mr. X being able to access the main area of the station, basically your safe area, makes you feel like there's nowhere to go to truly be safe. It's just done really well, and so it lands on my number 4 spot. Although it once took the number 1 spot on my list, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 takes the number 3 spot now, and although it's not my favorite, it is by far the game I have the most to say about, so strap in because it'll be a while. Marvel's Spider-Man 2 takes everything great about the first game and makes it better, and takes some mediocre things and turns them either good or great. The combat in this game is a big improvement as it's awesome to have special moves for each Spider-Man. They do vary in terms of how good they are, but they are mostly really fun to use, and it's cool that you don't have to use a focus bar on just one move that might not even work the way you want it to. The UI is also much more fun as well, as I didn't love how you had to slow down the whole game to swap gadgets in the first game. Now you can just hold R1 and press buttons and you shoot. They're really fun to use, although I wish they kept the web bomb and impact webs from the first game, and that's not even getting into the story. A lot of people don't like the story of this game, but I personally thought it was perfect. It has Peter getting a bit older and feeling like maybe he doesn't need to be Spider-Man anymore, and the symbiote is what makes him feel like the best Spider-Man that he can be, and having to give it up is obviously hard for him, and then it goes over to Harry. Both Harry and the symbiote feel betrayed by Peter, but Peter is still Harry's best friend, and the symbiote is angry at Peter, so their motivations kind of contradict each other, and they have to find a way to make both of them happy. Miles acts as a natural progression from his game, where he learned who he was as Spider-Man, but now he has to figure out who he is as Miles. I love No Way Home and the Spider-Verse movies, but while comparing this game to those is difficult, this game takes elements from a bunch of different Spider-Man media and combines it all in a way that was just perfect to me. It had the ultimate Spider-Man thing with Harry being basically another Spider-Man while using the black suit. It had Harry's Spider-Pal suit be the Agent Venom suit. The game had Peter get an anti-Venom suit. They made the symbiote spread throughout the city like Web of Shadows. They let you play as Venom like the Ultimate Spider-Man game, which was really fun. And they had Peter consult Connors to study the symbiote like in Spider-Man 3. And outside of just that, the story they told was unique, and the way they told it was great. You know throughout the game that something is going to happen to Harry. Most people expected him to be Venom, and he does end up being Venom. But the game goes out of its way to make you care about Harry, and makes you not want him to become Venom. When he eventually does, you're excited about it, but you're also sad. The story is just done so well, and it's really dark and emotional. Coincidentally, I actually predicted a couple parts of the game. A couple years ago, I made a fan pre-write of the game, but I never ended up turning it into a video, but I still have the doc. I managed to predict Venom being playable. I predicted the ability to fight and absolutely obliterate Kraven as Venom. I predicted an important story beat happening at Times Square. I predicted anti-Venom, and I predicted the Green Goblin tease, predicted Harry being Venom, and predicted Venom capturing MJ. Many of the aspects of these predictions were wrong, but I think it's cool that I was kind of on the right track. Outside of that, my pre-write was pretty bad, and I love the direction the game actually went way more. The MJ missions are also now a lot less slow-paced and are much more fun, especially the last one, which is basically a third-person Resident Evil game in disguise, hiding at the end of this Spider-Man game. Obviously, I don't think the MJ missions are one of the better parts of the game, but if they're gonna have them, I think they did them pretty well. Overall, the combat and the story is what makes me love all three Marvel Spider-Man games, and this game is better than both of the last two. The addition of the parry is really great, the symbiote is super fun to use, the symbiote surge is awesome, all the different symbiote suits included in the game look absolutely amazing, and Venom and Kraven were done to perfection in my opinion. The story in this game is so good that I even found myself so immersed in the story in some sections, like when fighting Peter, where I started saying things like, "Come on Pete," as if I was like actually Miles. The story managed to get me to immerse myself into it really well, and as everybody says basically as a meme now, it really does make me feel like Spider-Man. With all that being said, I do have a couple issues with the game, but the flaws I noticed were quite minor and they don't really bump the game down that much. I think the game has a bit less variety in the crimes and the enemy types, as once one enemy type is introduced, they are some of the only crimes you'll get. There's 4 different groups of enemies in this game, but you don't often get different crimes with each of them as you progress the story, often facing off against multiple types of enemies at once. And I also find it weird that Kraven just has an army of goons, but it makes sense in the context of this being a game with us needing to have enemies to fight, and I think it was implemented decently well. There's also this weird thing where you can sometimes knock an enemy to a certain area that you can't reach, which traps them outside, and it's difficult to do damage to them. That happened to me during the Scream boss fight, and it made me miss out on doing a bunch of damage. I also personally like the way that finishers worked in Miles Morales, as in the first game it wasn't really ever worth it to use an entire focus bar on just 1 or 2 enemies that you can easily beat without the finisher. In Miles Morales, you didn't have to spend the focus that you would use for healing on those finishers, and instead could just do finishers every time you got a 15-hit combo. In this game, they readopted the finisher mechanic from the first game, but in this game it's even less worth it to use it because you can't heal if you don't have an entire bar of focus. There's a lot of opportunity to take damage in this game, and so it's always important to build focus as much as possible, especially since the bar goes up pretty slow in this game. Since you can't heal without a full bar, using a finisher on just one enemy is not worth it at all. I will say though that I do like that the special moves on both Miles and Peter are completely separate from the focus bar, unlike in Miles Morales. So yeah, this game isn't without its flaws, but neither is any game, and while this game isn't 100% perfect, it is still a fantastic game and one of my favorites of all time. It was definitely shorter than the first game, but the story is packed full of great acting, combat, suits, storytelling, and everything in between. Yuri Lowenthal really deserves an award for his amazing performance in this game, especially when he has the symbiote and in relation to Harry at the end of the game, and there's also the entire Scream boss fight where Yuri Lowenthal pours his heart into his performance, and that was definitely one of the best parts of the game. The boss fight itself was great, but the voice lines playing in the background of it really made it as effective as possible. Yuri Lowenthal's performance is just consistently amazing, but I think he performs his best when Connors explains the symbiote to him.
We need to call Oscorp. We need to destroy it.
Destroy us?
Oh snap.
You said it chose me, Doug. It makes me a better Spider-Man.
I do wish Yuri Lowenthal won that award at the Game Awards because he 100% deserved it, but I haven't played Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm pretty sure the guy who won it deserved it too. Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest and most influential games of all time. It came out all the way back in 2005, and somehow it still holds up today. It revolutionized third-person survival horror. I actually played the Resident Evil 4 remake before the original game, but I played this game very recently, and I loved it so much. Sure, it's definitely a product of its time. The tone is a lot more goofy, and there's some lines that I think would definitely be frowned upon in today's society.
See you later.
Women.
And some of the characters are basically cartoons. But I think I explained my thoughts on this pretty well in my last Resident Evil 7 livestream, so I'll play you the clip right now. One thing I do think is that I kind of like it better when villains don't really act evil until like around the end. Like obviously they act like a villain, but they're not like cartoonishly evil basically until like towards the end of like stories. And I think that Sadler is kind of cartoonishly evil, but that doesn't mean like it doesn't come as a detriment, at least in the original RE4, because like I think that it kind of is like a product of its time, but obviously does hold up today. It's like It's kind of like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Like, if they were made nowadays exactly as they are, I don't think they would be as enjoyed as they were back then. And they still hold up today, but they're not, like, they're a product of their time, basically. Resident Evil 4's controls are really weird, especially not being able to move and shoot in the absence of a reticle or crosshair, but as I said in that clip, it's a product of its time, and while it does take some getting used to, once you do, it's incredibly fun. It offers a fun challenge, and while that kind of mechanic is pretty much never used in modern gaming, the way the combat and controls were, and even just a third-person over-the-shoulder view, was so revolutionary at the time. So many different games like The Last of Us, Dead Space and its sequels, and the remake, and even Fortnite would not exist, or at the very least would be very different and probably not as good without this game. It was just such a fun experience that honestly I could play whenever. I originally would have placed it at number 5, but then I bumped it up quite a lot, and now it's at the number 2 spot on my list. One of my real life friends actually bought the game and he complained that it was slow, but I told him that's one of the challenges, and while it definitely has a pretty big learning curve, once you get used to the controls, it becomes one of the most fun games to play ever. At least in my opinion. He won't believe me, but I stand by that. Up until relatively recently, I wasn't into Resident Evil at all. I'd never played any of the games, and I didn't even really know anything about the series outside of the fact that 7 had VR and there were zombies in some games. But there was one day in March of 2023 when my friends and I were in a voice call and we started watching 8-Bit Ryan's video on the new Resident Evil 4 remake. When watching the beginning couple minutes of his video, I found that the game looked pretty good, and I decided the next day to buy the game on PS5, which at the time I'd gotten only a few weeks prior, and I played it that day and my sister watched me play. I began playing on standard difficulty, but I quickly found that I had literally no experience playing Resident Evil, and I was terrible at it. I wasn't even having fun, I was genuinely just annoyed. I ended up dying 14 times in the beginning village battle before I switched over to the easier difficulty, and I quickly found the game to be one of the greatest of all time. Obviously now I'm much better at the game and don't use aim assist anymore. I've gone back and forth a lot on whether I like RE4 Remake or Marvel Spider-Man 2 the best, but I decided both RE4s are definitely better than Spider-Man 2, even though I absolutely love Spider-Man 2. Matter of fact, I had to do a lot of editing around because I changed a few of my opinions even after recording this video, but that's besides the point. Resident Evil 4 Remake is an amazing game. I really like the changes they made to the story and gameplay from the original RE4, making the game much more based around modern mechanics and controls. The original is a fantastic game, especially for the time, and while I love it, I like Resident Evil 4 Remake better as a game. I just think the story is greatly improved and slightly less ridiculous and cartoonish, and they gave Luis, Ada, and Krauser a much bigger role in the story. In the original RE4, Luis, Ada, and Krauser were kinda useless, they didn't really do that much, but the remake makes them matter much more. The gameplay is also super smooth, all the weapons sound the way that they should and function really well, and I love the Separate Ways DLC as well. The Mercenaries is also really fun to just play casually. My favorite part of the game is the part in the cabin with Luis in Chapter 5. I love all the treasure and side quests too. I just love everything about this game. I also love the addition of parrying with the knife. Sometimes it's a bit ridiculous that a knife and a knife alone is enough to deflect a tentacle from a giant mega powerful parasitic monster, but it's forgivable just because of how fun it is to do. Sometimes if there's only one enemy left, I like to just wait for them to strike first rather than striking first myself, just so that I can parry the attack. I can definitely understand placing the original RE4 over the remake, especially if you grew up with it, but it came out 2 years before I was even born and I only played it recently. It's already on this list, so obviously I love it, but I don't love it for nostalgia reasons. Ada and especially Ashley were greatly improved in my opinion, and while I'm not the biggest fan of her voice, Ada's character was done really well, her Separate Ways DLC was great, and she and Ashley also have some other features. I do really love the original, and I still did place it at number 2 on my list, but the remake is just slightly better in my eyes. Though again, I can see either being placed above the other. I honestly don't think I'll ever get tired of playing either, but that especially goes for the remake. As a matter of fact, I'm currently doing a series playing through Resident Evil 4 Remake in its VR mode, so if you haven't, go check that out. It's a lot of fun. But that is my list of my top 10 favorite video games of all time. What are your favorite games? Let me know in the comments, and if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys! And if you have a relationship, enjoy your Valentine's Day. Yay.